Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Professor Barry here. Another installment in Sociology of Deviance. This is week 6, finished up the midterm. The midterm, just kind of reviewing kind of major ideas, themes throughout the course of the term. Hopefully you feel like you've got a pretty good foundation of some concepts, theories, ideas related to sociology of deviance and crime, and that it's kind of added to your kind of understanding of um, this topic area. And we're going to continue on, the next few weeks, going to focus on this week, moral panics, social constructionism, and then we're going to get into labeling theory and spend a couple weeks in labeling theory, and then we'll start to kind of bring things all together. Yeah, so there's an article that's posted in the weekly module. I encourage you to read that, but I will cover the main ideas of moral panics in this lecture. So feel free to bypass the article. I think the article has a lot of valuable content. It'll provide more context, more information, more detail. But if you just want to kind of push it to the side or just scan it, look over different parts of it, that's totally fine as well. All right, so let's do a little setup for moral panics. Before we get into discussing moral panics, we got to talk about some other concepts first. So first thing is talk about a couple different philosophical approaches or positions when we're thinking about trying to understand the world around us, the social world, the physical world, whatever it may be. And we have these two different philosophical approaches or ideas about how to understand the world. So we have what's called ontology, and then we have epistemology. So ontology is the study of things like in their essence of how things are. So I want you to draw back into the ideas of positivism and this idea of verifiability, empiricism, measuring. So the idea of ontology is there's an essential characteristic about things that we can study, we can analyze, we can objectively understand what's going on in the social world or physical world. So there's an essence that's immeasurable, that's something that can be measured. So that's like one particular approach. Then there's epistemology, which is how we come to know something, the study of the development of knowledge, the study of the development of ways of thinking and knowing. Epistemology gets us more into the constructionist side of things. So ontology is more of a positivist kind of component. There's an essential nature. We're measuring that essential nature of something. We are verifying our measurement. It's like there's an essential characteristics that can be objectively understood. Epistemology is about the construction of knowledge, like how do we come to know something? And it's the development, the study of how we acquire a way of thinking, a way of knowing. So how do we connect these to deviance? And how do we connect them to the class? So we can measure something like violent crime, and that's measurable. I mean, you look at homicide rates, that when there's a homicide committed, almost always it's reported. There's going to be a report to the police. There's going to be a conviction. They're tracked. So the tracking of homicides are really reliable. And as far as the measurement tools we have for measuring the number of homicides in a given year is highly accurate. And in a sense, that idea from a positivist viewpoint, it's a pretty, it's an accurate measure of what's going on in the world around us. It's an ontological kind of approach to trying to understand something like violent crime. Now we get into epistemology. We get into like, well, how do we think about violent crime? What are the meanings that we associate with violent crime? And I'm going to go back to data here for a second and say, well, we could collect data on, we're collecting data on who committed violent crimes or who committed homicides. We collect data on gender, can collect data on race, but we don't collect data on social class of individuals who've committed homicide. It's possible that that omission of things like social class, and we don't often see data on educational level and homicide, that if we focus on like what's being reported more often is gender and race, then we're constructing this idea that violent crime and homicide is being driven by race, driven by gender, and we're eliminating from our viewpoint discussion, our development of knowledge, the influence of something like social class, educational level, um, employment level, on impact on degree of violent crime or homicide. So we need to have both. Like both have like the lab coat scientist evidence, measurable, but also be critical of that viewpoint, and then also epistemological to understand how things develop, the meanings that we associate with things, and then understand that constructionist side, and then be aware of the limits of that model as well. So here's a couple points of consideration. It's possible that the level of objective harm is not necessarily connected to the identification of something as deviant or criminal. So I go back before, I've talked about same-sex relations, male-to-male same-sex relations, not objectively harmful, but historically, at certain point in times in histories and culture, in certain cultures, viewed as being deviant and or criminal as a criminal act. This isn't about objective level of harm. History of marijuana, alcohol, prohibition. So keeping in mind that we have the ontological, let's say alcohol, the actual data that we could gather on the impact of alcohol on individuals and society. We're measuring that ontological, but then we get the constructed side, cultural values, beliefs, and ideas about alcohol. And there doesn't necessarily have to be a connection. I think an interesting example is marijuana. I remember looking, in class last year during a class meeting, looked up the THC level of marijuana in the 1970s. And at the top of my head, I can't remember what it was, the THC level. I don't know. I think it was like 3, 4, 5% or something like that. Fast forward to today, it's not uncommon to get THC levels 20%, 25% in terms of THC level within marijuana. If you look at it from the objective, from the pharmacological properties of those two substances, it's like in the 1970s, that would have been a time period. It seemed like that marijuana should have been legal. It was less a lower level of toxicity or of THC within with THC within the plant, what people were consuming versus today. So today THC level is much higher, but recreational medicinal use of marijuana legal. So what we're doing here, what I'm kind of illustrating is that I guess I do have information about marijuana in the past versus present, but that there doesn't necessarily have to be a connection between the objective level and the perception level. Case number 2, objective level harm may be neutral, but people start to identify something as being deviant or criminal. So prohibition, led to criminalization of the production and distribution of alcohol. The objective level of harm was not like it all of a sudden alcohol became a problem. It's like alcohol was doing what it was doing within communities and societies, their impact, but it's all of a sudden that all of a sudden that it became associated with being deviant or criminal. Number 3 is it could be the objective level of harm is really high, but things are not being associated with being deviant or criminal. So for example, before the 1980s, and I'll talk about this near the end of this lecture, before the 1980s, drinking and driving was viewed as a folk crime, as something that happened, but it wasn't highly criminalized, very rarely prosecuted. It was treated very lightly as something, as an offense. And so the objective level was still relatively high, though, wasn't, but people were not, and society and laws and institutions were not treating it as a significant kind of an event. And case number 4 could be that objective level of harm is really low, but people define it in society. We define something as being deviant or criminal. So sodomy laws all the way from the 1600s to the 1960s and 70s and on. Sodomy laws, male to male, sexual encounters. And you look back historically, that took until Illinois was the first state to remove sodomy laws in 1962. More states started removing them in the 1970s. And it wasn't because, changes with the degree of harm. It was about constructed ideas and about perspective, a lot of epistemological stuff that were going on there. And then by 2003, the US Supreme Court identified sodomy laws as being unconstitutional. Okay, so that's a little bit of a background we're getting into moral panics. We have to provide that foundation that we're going to get into like social constructionism, but we need to be able to compare the ontological, the actual measurable, verifiable, like what's going on in the actual world versus what's going on in the constructed world. And we need to be able to compare the two. There's value in being able to do that. So social constructionism is, like the world is the meaning that we give things within the world. We respond to things based on the meaning that we give things in the world. So we're focused on social constructionism, like how does meaning get developed? How do ideas get developed? Who's influencing the development of ways that we think, the ways that we know as a culture, as a society, as a place, as a people? And then meanings can get institutionalized to the point where they become viewed as being natural or inevitable. We don't even see and recognize that these meanings were actually constructed. So things get taken for granted, certain ways of thinking and knowing. I think marijuana provides kind of an interesting case where there's meanings of marijuana were developed for long periods of time, starting in the 1930s and 40s, as far as criminalization and demonization of marijuana. Those ideas were institutionalized through laws, education, mass media, like a lot of institutions reaffirming supporting this idea about the dangers of marijuana happen in so many different ways and spaces. People got socialized into these, became institutionalized, became taken for granted. No one was questioning that idea for a long period of time. And it just became the constructed reality. So the constructed reality wasn't based on verifiable truth, but as a constructed reality. So meanings can become generally agreed upon, become taken for granted. Meanings are arbitrary. Arbitrary meaning there doesn't have to be a meaning specifically associated with something. It's arbitrary. There may be reasons for it, historical, cultural, social, but the meanings that we associate things, they are arbitrary. The meaning that we associate towards alcohol, arbitrary. Could be viewed as a good thing, as a bad thing, and viewed in different ways. It's just humans creating meaning, and we respond to the world based on the meaning that we give things. This is where we're going to start getting to think about moral panics. We start to create an idea about something. We construct this idea. These ideas may get institutionalized. And then the public may start to get to this space where they take it for granted. They don't question these constructive meanings. Then we develop policies based on these meanings, and the policies can be very misguided and have significant consequences to them. I think there's sort of the idea that, meanings are arbitrary, but they're very real, because if we construct them that way, we believe them to be that way. We don't question them. They have real impacts. So even though, race is a social construct, race is not determined by biology. Race is social cultural. It's like the meaning that we give in terms of like racial classifications and racial groups. At the same time, it's real. Because we've defined it that way, we've explained it that way, we've created categories around race. And so we can't deny the way that we've constructed things have created a reality. But we're distinguishing between that constructed reality and the actual reality itself. So the Thomas theorem is this idea that if you define it as real, it's real in its consequences. So it gets us into thinking about if you define it as real. So it's about our definition of things. There's different variabilities of a constructionist viewpoint. So there's the hard constructionist viewpoint who just really focus on like everything is constructed, everything is arbitrary, and kind of goes maybe, I don't know, I'm going to say extreme, or goes really in a strong position that way. Then there's a moderate constructionist view, which is more of a things are constructed. There's meanings that are developed. There's a lot of arbitrariness in that, but there's also some truth in that in some constructions as well. There's an empirical, verifiable kind of component for some constructions, and so it's more of a kind of a moderate plane between the two fields of epistemological and ontological idea. So here's an example, okay, social constructionism. Violent crime rates per 100,000 people decreased from 1993 to the 2020s. I mean, significantly, like by half, right? So if you were to ask Americans, just ask your friend, people like, what do you think's happened with violent crime rate over the last 30 years? I gather that most people are going to say that it's gone up. And the reality is, it's gone down by, it's gone down significantly. So, people's perceptions of what's going on versus reality could be two different things. Violent crime increased from 1960 to 1993 in significant ways. Now, that's a data point, that's ontological. Now, the meaning we give that, like, why did that happen? We could still get into ontological. We're trying to measure the factors that influence that, but we're also potentially going to get into a constructed reality about that too, that we're constructing ideas and developing ideas of how to explain things. And sometimes it could be based on really good verifiable information, but sometimes it's based on a lot of cultural values, ideals, and beliefs and ideologies and things that are going on, that we're constructing a story, telling a story, a narrative, which may not actually be true. So with that, things going on between 1960 and 1993, led to things like Nixon in the 1970s declared, President Nixon, a war on crime and a war on drugs. Public enemy number one, narcotics. That was the language used at that time. Narcotics was public enemy number one. I mean, this is constructionism now. I mean, you start to elevate public enemy number one. It's going to be a little bit of a moral panic potentially. And then by the time we get to the 1980s, with President Reagan stepping into office in 1980, that we start a decades-long approach to mass incarceration and the war on drugs. There's the ontological. We could measure drug use, drug possession, individuals, we could measure who's being incarcerated, who's being subjected to the criminal justice system. But then we can also measure, like, well, let's look at the epistemological. What's the stories we're telling about drugs, drug use, the impacts of drugs on society? How's the media? How are politicians constructing ideas? Like, we can get into a lot of that kind of space. Criminal offense data identifies race, but not social class. I mentioned that before. So construction of a problem as an ethnic group culture and an individual level problem versus looking at the structure of society itself. It's possible that we're constructing ideas of violent crime, and the data we collect is reinforcing an idea that it's either a pathology within a particular racial group, ethnic group, or a particular individuals, and not addressing the larger structural kind of component, institutions, economic inequality, and these kind of things. Crack epidemic, and I put it in quotation marks because that was the language of the time. The epidemic of the 1980s, 90s promoted this idea that, that drugs were a crime problem versus a public health problem. And, there needs to be a balance in there, I would argue, between, between figuring out where's the correct place of a criminalization of drug possession and use, and where did we focus on something as a public health problem and try to provide support and resources to address the issues of addiction and the impact of on communities of drug use and possession within society. There's a balance in there somewhere. But in the 1980s and 1990s, there was not any room for discussion about public health. It was all criminalization. Things like harm reduction approaches, which Western European countries have done for long periods of time, were so foreign to the United States. We are just in a different culture, a different place, and ideas of harm reduction and public health were far from being accepted in the United States until relatively recent years. In Oregon, for example, moved towards that public health model more so, and then learning lessons from that. So the classical, recalling the classical school of criminology, determinant sentencing, the rational choice theory, that classical criminology, this idea of the punishment needs to be swift, needs to be certain, and it needs to be severe enough. So during this time of a moral panic in the 1980s and 1990s around crack cocaine, led to increased penalties, increased mass incarceration. This was a sort of belief that, if we just increase the penalty, that would sort of solve the problem or mediate the problem. During a time of moral panic, people are caught into this sort of space. It leads to major changes in policies that have long-lasting impacts. And we'll kind of talk about that as a characteristic of moral panics. Okay, so moral panic. So a moral panic. So people feel threatened. There's a panic, there's a fear going on, a fear that ways of life are being threatened and that there's going to be a major, like a downfall to society, culture, system. So there's a fear around a particular issue that people feel threatened by. People largely across society feel threatened by some change that's going on. So widespread fear that some people or some groups, something threatens the value, safety, or ways of life of community or society at large. Usually there's a folk devil that's identified as a source of a threat. So with the moral panic, there has to be like this target that's identified as the source of threat. In a lot of ways, like political discourse around illegal immigration, undocumented workers, undocumented individuals in the United States, there's a lot of fear mongering going on in that space by politicians. There's a lot of moral panic going on. And the person who's undocumented becomes the folk devil. This is not to say that we should not be having like discussions about our immigration policy. It's rather saying when politicians and the media sometimes may get into blaming, scapegoating a lot of problems on particular groups and individuals, these individuals are often what we call the folk devils. These are the individuals who are being viewed as the cause of the threat to ways of life being and knowing within a society. So the claims of harm are often exaggerated, or not often, they are exaggerated. So going back like things like, undocumented workers, illegal immigration, the claims of harm are often they're exaggerated. There's a story that's being told that's reinforcing an idea of the fear that's based on fear that's reinforcing it. Claims of harm are exaggerated. The mass media and claims makers capitalize on the fear that's there. Maybe there's a fear. It's always chicken and the egg. It's hard to know. Like, was the fear already there, and then the politicians and the media kind of amplified it, or did the politicians and the media actually create it? And we'll talk about 3 different perspectives of moral panics on the next slide. But it's something to think about. Is like, how do we see that relationship between politicians, the mass media, political leaders, and the public from regarding who's leading who in terms of creating these kind of fears? For moral panics, we have to understand the context around them, the historical context, the time period, what's going on socially in the world of economics, what's going on in the world at large. And it's that context becomes really important to be able to understand the degree to which moral panics may take hold. So if we go back to the functionalism and Durkheim and Kai Erikson and Wayward Puritans and the Salem witch trials, that sometimes it's the moral panics, it's about the temperature of the audience or the temper of the audience. So what's going on with the audience, and an audience at a particular moment in time, if they feel threatened by something, they may be looking for a scapegoat, looking for a folk devil to, I don't know, like address their own fears and anxieties, and they're placing those fears and anxieties on another group of individuals. So I think it's important to understand the context around which moral panics develop. Salem witch trials, like why that particular moment in time in particular location, why did they develop? And there's different reasons to explain that particular moral panic. So there may be certain conditions that may be necessary, but not sufficient for a moral panic. And by that, I just sort of mean that we're never going to be able to say, like, okay, go down a list, like, okay, these conditions are met, therefore there will be a moral panic. It's more like, well, here's some common characteristics of moral panics that are often present to different degrees, but they don't necessarily all have to be present. So for a moral panic, the different stages are: one, there's a concern about something in the public has a concern about something. And that concern, people start to become, they start to be more concerned about a particular social issue, social problem, or an event. Then people get sensitized to it. So their attention is drawn to it. And now all of a sudden people start seeing it where it was going on before, but now they didn't notice it. But now they have a high level concern. They've been sensitized to it. They start to see it and they start to identify it more and more and more. I remember when, the issues of vaping and vape pens exploding like years ago. I think it's like stories that were going on. And I'm sure there's a kernel of truth. There's a little bit of truth to that. But then I remember walking on campus one day and somebody was vaping, and I'm like, oh man, that thing could explode. And that's sensitive. That's sort of like, it's a great example of sensitization, right? So you hear the story about something, seen people vaping, before that a lot. All of a sudden I see this story. Now I got this association. So vaping and there could be a death and a fire going on, a person could blow up. I don't know. It's like we've been sensitized to things. And that's an important part. So people have a concern. People can get into the space where they start to see things that were there before, but now they start to see them and identify particular meanings to them. That hostility is directed towards a folk devil. There has to be like a group or an individuals who are identified as the source of the problem. There tends to start to be a consensus that gets developed across the community that that these folk devils are the problem and that we need to do something about it. So the general consensus starts to develop, and then there becomes disproportional responses. So social control mechanisms are put into place. So to go back to like the Salem witch trials, the persecution of individuals who are identified as witches, who were basically put to death or punished and tortured, that response was disproportional. These social control measures are put into place. They're misdirected. They're way out of proportion to what's going on. And, the war on drugs, 1980s, 1990s, there's a lot of that stuff going on. 3 strikes, you're outlaws, determinant sentencing, locking people up for life for drug possession. I mean, these are disproportional and they're misdirected. And then volatility, moral panics, they can arrive really fast, but they can go away really fast as well. And, the problem is during a moral panic, we create these disproportional responses, these social control mechanisms, then the panic goes away, and then we're stuck with these institutions and legacies. So we ramp up the war on drugs in the 1980s, 1990s, start building a lot of institutions of social control, a lot of prisons. The war on drugs goes away, declines. The public fear goes away. We don't have the moral panic, but now we have a system of mass incarceration that's put into place. So long-term impact. And then we have these sort of 3 models. How do we think about moral panics? One is that the elite engineer them, so that people in power are the ones generating the moral panics. They're the one fueling them for political interest and particular gain, a gain for power, a gain for resources. So we could think about, the elite. Well, we'll work through all 3 of them, then I'll provide an example of all 3. So then you have special interest groups may be involved in moral panics. So maybe a little bit less about the politicians now and the political leaders, but organizations may be involved in facilitating a moral panic. A lot of stuff recently on sex trafficking, and there's good discussion about sex trafficking and being aware of what's going on with sex trafficking. There's deontological going on, like there's something happening, we can measure it, we can understand it. It's important to know what's going on more verifiably. But we also have special interest groups who receive money and funding and resources for promoting education, but also fear-mongering around sex trafficking as well. And there's a balance in there, between just sort of education and information and then escalating fears. I mean, and there may be interest served to escalating kind of fears. So I go back to the war on drugs. There's a lot of special interest groups that were going on during that time period. The National Council for Drug Abuse, organizations were really receiving a lot of federal funding, and they wanted to continue to receive that funding. So they have an interest in keeping this moral panic alive or building the moral panic. And then a moral panic grassroots level could be coming from the community itself, coming from people. It's not coming from political leaders or institutions, but rather it's coming from the people itself. If I look at that last one, that there's this satanic moral panic, the satanic panic of the 1970s, and a lot of fear and concerns around satanic worship, devil music, Black Sabbath, all kinds of different things going on that time period. And that came, I think, more from the ground up. That was more of a grassroots type of moral panic. I think you look at the war on drugs, you get the lead engineer that politicians are building and leading this to distract us from looking at the real economic problems in urban communities and environments. The elite are engineering this particular war on drugs for their own political economic gain. And then special interest groups can be involved in it as well. Could be like institutions, those involved in the correctional system, those who are groups and organizations that are about building more prisons. And they have an interest in keeping the war on drugs alive. So it's like that kind of component. Give you a couple different examples. There's a concern around sex abuse in daycare centers back in the 1980s. There was a lot of hysteria, a lot of panic around this. Kind of really fascinating, and you kind of put it in context. So if I go back to that idea about moral panic, it's important to kind of put it in context. Right here, 1970s, feminist movement in 1970s, women are entering the workforce, daycare centers become a relatively new thing. They're being used by more and more people. There's a thing called stranger danger that's going on at this particular moment in time. There comes more awareness about sexual abuse within families. A lot of things that are going on in that historical context leads to this sort of panic around daycare centers. And Mary McMartin Preschool in California, his first media court, like the court case that received a lot of media attention. Manhattan Beach, California, there's all these accusations that kids were being kidnapped, that they're being flown to different locations, forced into group sex, that they were being forced to observe animal maiming and torture, that child pornography was going on. In 1984, 7 teachers were charged, 2 went to trial. These trials were the longest and the most expensive in U.S. history at that moment in time. All charges were dropped in 1990. These were all allegations. They're all based on fear. There's a lot of fear going on about things like divorce and separation and, women entering the workforce, and a lot of public anxieties. And this particular moral panic arose during that particular kind of time period. Another one is 1970s, 1980s in heavy metal and rap music. If you ever heard of the Tipper sticker or the Parents, there's an organization, the Parents Music Resource Center, that was started by the Washington Wives. Political, so Tipper Gore, Al Gore, former vice president under President Clinton. These Washington Wives, wives of senators and House members got together, that these were the moral entrepreneurs of the time, that they said, this devil music, heavy metal music, and rap music is dangerous, creating violent behavior and problem behavior among our youth. We need to do something about it. So there was a Senate hearing with the Parents Music Resource Center. It's really entertaining. Check out that YouTube video, D. Snyder versus Tipper Gore 84. Put that in the search engine, and it's super fascinating what was going on at that particular moment in time. I'll go back to Amy Bender here in a second, but the thing of like, well, the temper of the audience at that moment in time, and who is the audience? This goes back to like audience response a few weeks ago. Let's think about the audience. Like, why are these moral panics being created? Understanding that with the moral panic, these things are volatile. They happen fast. There was a sort of panic around heavy metal and rap, and there's definitely no longer one anymore. But then we get an institutional legacy like these stickers that get placed on albums, like explicit lyrics or whatever it may be. So Amy Bender, in her article, I used to have students read this from my pop culture class, that the media was constructing this story that about heavy metal music, that she uses the language of the media was telling a story that that heavy metal and these ideas of satanic worship and heavy metal music was harmful to our youth, predominantly white youth, and we need to protect our white youth. For rap music, the lyrics and the content of the lyrics that was viewed that it was leading to violent behavior among predominantly Black males and Black males in the inner city communities, and that we needed to protect ourselves from this group of individuals. This was what the media story was telling. So constructing these ideas about who the listeners are, what's happening within this music, and this audience response is a reflection of the ideas of prominent white individuals who are promoting particular ideas based on their own their own racial biases, stereotypes, and ideals. And then finally, kind of give you a kind of changing views and impacts, a cautionary tale. Look at this is an article about the social construction of the alcohol problem, gives us an idea of thinking about the ontological, the epistemological, and then kind of getting into not necessarily a moral panic, but just sort of the idea of constructing ideas around alcohol. But certain time periods, definitely a moral panic going on. So here's kind of like a historical perspective on alcohol. So colonial America, alcohol is viewed by I think it was Benjamin Franklin, who said it's a good creature of God. In a lot of ways, alcohol was, well, not a lot of ways, it was more sanitary than water in a lot of places and locations. It was viewed as a good creature of God. I mean, it was just part of the world. It was pleasurable, and it was also maybe more sanitary than water itself. By the 1900s, early 1900s, after, let's say 50 years, 70 years of industrialization and urbanization, business leaders, the medical community, religious leaders started to talk about temperance, that alcohol is sinful, alcohol is evil, alcohol leads to a lot of social problems, including poverty and crime and other social problems. This is also a time period of a lot of immigration from Eastern Europe and from Ireland. So people who are others are entering into America. It's also a time period of eugenics, a belief that hereditary factors are the reason for crime and poverty and other social problems and ills, and the idea that we can create a stronger society by controlling the gene pool. This campaign that was predominantly led by middle-class Protestant white women. So these are the moral entrepreneurs of the time. There's a moral panic going on during this time period that led to prohibition. So there's this quote: the growth of middle-class supporters for legislative and constitutional prohibition should be understood paradoxically both as attacks on the symbols of corporate capitalist society and also a part of a larger search for order. And I think that's kind of an important component here, is that there was this attack going on against the industry, but also this idea, the temper of the audience, people were searching for order within society, that there was anomie going on, there was sudden dramatic change, there was problems going on in community, and people were looking at people who are consuming alcohol. These were the folk devils. People were selling it. They were the folk devils. People were producing it, folk devils. And we need to search. There's this panic going on and a search for order around this. So business leaders supported prohibition because people who are workers, if they came to work and they've been drinking, it impacted, the number of accidents at work. There was the fear of unionization. So after work, people go to the bar. Workers going to the bar where there's union, they're involved in union talk. And there's fear among business leaders that alcohol and bars and places like that were places where people were talking about labor and labor rights. And so one way of supporting prohibition to help ensure that there was less talk about unionization, and unions would, threaten the capitalist. And it sort of served as this focus on alcohol as the evil distracted people's attention from looking at the structures of society as a result of industrialization. Um, and by taking on this idea of like the Protestant white women were trying, the moral entrepreneurs taking care of society, trying to make society better, the public got on board with that. And I think, Upton Sinclair, this quote's great one: prohibition became a sort of a moral mask for big business. The big business got on board and they could wear this sort of moral mask, that they're doing the right thing, the good thing, that they're a moral leader within the United States. Then we moved to the Great Depression. Prohibition was repealed. And this concluded, well, we repealed it because, the employment conditions changed, economic conditions have changed. And now it's like, well, selling alcohol could be a tax base, and we need that tax revenue to fund resources and institutions. The disease model of alcohol consumption emerges during this time period. Alcoholism, this word alcoholism starts to become something that gets constructed. Evil of alcohol moves from the bottle to the person. Now it's a medical view versus a moral view, or medical and moral view. Then we moved to the 1980s, it was called a new temperance movement. So we have changing ideas and values in American culture and society about health and wellness. The jogging craze is going on in the 1970s. People get more focused on exercise and health and wellness. There's an anti-smoking campaign. There's a concern about drinking and driving and about fatalities. So the temper of the audience has shifted. So the number of fatalities were not increasing in the 1970s, 1980s. They'd been steady. But then an incident happened with Candy Lightner, a mother whose daughter was run over by a drunk driver or killed by a drunk driver, or somebody had been drinking and driving. Person had been charged multiple times for drinking and driving, and was released multiple times from probably like local city, county jails, but never served long time or sentences. And, I think the person was out on their fifth offense or something like that. And it's when Candy Lightner's daughter was killed by this particular individual. And she formed this organization, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and was identified as the voice of the victim. So they advocated for criminalization, higher levels of punishment, increasing the drinking age it used to be 18, that's 21, and regulating businesses for how they sold and distributed alcohol. This organization was relatively politically conservative. It fit with the political climate of the time on individual responsibility. It focused on the user versus the industry itself. And there's another organization called SMART, Stop Marketing Alcohol on Radio and TV. And these leaders were also advocating for doing something different, and that was to start regulating industry in a different way, to put parameters on and limitations on the business, the alcohol industry, their ability to advertise and market. And MAD, as an organization, sent a memo out to local chapters: don't support this organization, because if we do so, we're going to lose support from politicians and political leaders. So yeah, I think I bring all this up to say, MAD is an organization. They've done some amazing things, some really positive things for our communities. Also a moral entrepreneur. They were involved in, shaping ideas, and why would they be opposed to it? It seems like they would be supportive of addressing, anything to address alcohol consumption and problems related to that. But they're an organization, there's political stuff going on in that space. We could look at drug wars and make this connection between drug wars and racial ethnic groups and class biases. If we get in times of a moral panic and we're going through these, we start to scapegoat these groups. The folk devil becomes a source of the problem, but we're not really, the source of problem is a constructive problem versus the ontological versus the real root of the problem. We're not looking at the real root of the problem. We're being distracted during this time of panic. We build these institutions in response to that, and then we have to live with the long-term legacy of that. There's interests that are being served by these. The public may assist in building this sort of consensus view about the panic. I think the crack epidemic of the 80s and 90s is a powerful example. The war on drugs was supported by both Democrats and Republicans. Democrats under President Clinton escalated the war on drugs in ways that Republicans much a higher level than Republicans did before that. Mass incarceration, prison building. This is where we get to, we have 4%, 5% of the world population, but incarcerate 20 to 25% of the world's incarcerated population in the United States. So that moral panic led to some serious consequences. Okay, so yeah, that's it. A lot of stuff on moral panics. Hopefully that was kind of informative. And I wish you well. Have a great day. Be safe out there and catch you next week.